Welcome to our YouTube channel. Today, we bring you a story full of surprises and hidden angles that few people know about. Don't leave just yet. Just when you think you've figured it all out, there are fascinating and meaningful details waiting for you at the end of the video. Let's explore together and uncover the special message this video has for you. Are you ready? Let's get started. The story of Geronimo is one woven with threads of both tragedy and triumph, of a man whose very name would evoke fear and respect among his enemies and deep reverence among his people. Born in the 1820s in what is now modern-day New Mexico or Arizona, Geronimo's early life was shaped by the harsh realities of survival and conflict in a time when the Apache people were constantly at odds with the encroaching forces of Mexican and American settlers. However, few realized that this legendary warrior, one who would become a symbol of Native American resistance against foreign invaders, began his life with a name that translated to the one who yawns. His birth name was Guerrilla, a seemingly peaceful and unassuming title for someone who would later grow into one of the most formidable figures of the 19th century. But fate would not allow Guerrilla to live out a quiet life, and soon the world would know him by another name, Geronimo. The origin of this new name remains a mystery, with multiple theories swirling around its true meaning. Some suggest that during one of Geronimo's infamous raids on Mexican forces, terrified soldiers cried out to Saint Jerome for protection, thus bestowing upon him the name we know today. Others argue that it may have simply been a nickname given by the Mexicans, or a mispronunciation of his original name. Yet, regardless of its origin, the name Geronimo would forever be etched in history as one of the most iconic warriors of the American Southwest. But this story is not merely one of a name. It is a tale of immense personal loss, vengeance, and the unyielding spirit of resistance. Geronimo's life was marked by a tragedy that would ignite a fire in his soul, a fire that would burn through decades of warfare and unrest. As a young man, Geronimo witnessed the brutal murder of his wife, his 3 young children, and his mother at the hands of Mexican soldiers. This horrific event occurred while he was away on a trading expedition, and when he returned, he found his home destroyed, his loved ones slaughtered. The shock of this unspeakable loss transformed him from a skilled warrior into a man consumed by revenge. From that moment forward, his life would be dedicated to avenging his family and fighting back against the relentless forces that sought to destroy his people. Geronimo's path of vengeance was swift and merciless. He launched raid after raid on Mexican forces, becoming known for his tactical brilliance and fierce leadership. His attacks were brutal, often catching his enemies off guard and leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The name Geronimo soon became synonymous with terror, and to those who crossed his path, he was more than just a man. He was a force of nature, an unstoppable presence that could appear without warning and vanish just as quickly into the rugged desert landscape. Yet, even as he exacted his revenge, Geronimo's life remained fraught with hardship. He was constantly on the run, pursued by both Mexican and American forces who sought to capture or kill him. His people were driven from their lands, forced to endure starvation, disease, and the horrors of relocation. Despite the overwhelming odds, Geronimo refused to surrender, leading his people through years of guerrilla warfare in a desperate bid for survival. His determination, his refusal to bow to the powers that be, made him a hero among the Apache and a symbol of resistance for all Native Americans who were facing the grim reality of displacement and annihilation. Geronimo's relentless warfare against the Mexicans and later the United States Army would carry him to the edges of the frontier and beyond. His reputation as a fierce and cunning warrior grew, and his ability to evade capture became legendary. At one point, Geronimo and a small band of followers held out against thousands of U.S. troops sent to bring them to heel. His knowledge of the land, his use of guerrilla tactics, and his unwavering resolve made him one of the last Native American leaders to continue active resistance against the U.S. government. But Geronimo's story is also one of profound contradictions. Despite his prowess in battle and his fierce defiance of authority, Geronimo would ultimately be captured, imprisoned, and used as a tool of American propaganda. After years of evading capture, he surrendered in 1886 under the promise that he and his followers would be returned to their homeland. Instead, they were shipped off to Florida, where they were held as prisoners of war. Geronimo spent the last years of his life far from the lands he had fought so hard to defend, a living relic of a bygone era. In his final years, Geronimo became a curious figure. In American society, he was paraded around at fairs and exhibitions as a symbol of the Wild West, a relic of a vanishing way of life. At the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, he was even put on display as part of an Indian village, where fairgoers could pay to shake hands with the legendary warrior. Though he had been reduced to a sideshow attraction, Geronimo never lost his pride or his sense of identity. He remained a fierce advocate for his people, speaking out against the injustices they continued to face. In 1909, at the age of 79, Geronimo passed away, still a prisoner of the U.S. government. His death marked the end of an era, but his legacy lived on. To this day, Geronimo is remembered not just as a warrior, but as a symbol of the indomitable spirit of resistance. His name continues to evoke images of defiance and courage, of a man who refused to surrender even in the face of overwhelming odds. Geronimo's life is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the power of one individual to stand against the tides of history and fight for what they believe is right. Though he may have been born the one who yawns, Geronimo's legacy is one that will never rest. His name, once spoken in fear, is now remembered in reverence, a name that will echo through the ages as a symbol of strength, defiance, and the enduring fight for freedom. The story of Geronimo took a dark and violent turn in 1851, when his life was irreparably altered by one of the most traumatic events any person could experience. As an Apache warrior, Geronimo had long been accustomed to the constant skirmishes and battles that defined the existence of his people. But nothing could have prepared him for the devastation he would face upon returning to his camp after what was meant to be a routine trading mission. In response to the Apache's frequent raids to gather horses and supplies, the Mexican government had implemented a brutal policy of retaliation. They ambushed Apache settlements and, in a grotesque incentive, began offering bounties for Apache scalps. This grisly practice would reach its most horrific expression in 1851, when Colonel Jose Maria Carrasco and a force of around 400 Mexican soldiers descended upon Geronimo's encampment, while Geronimo and several other warriors were away. In the town of Llanos, the soldiers ransacked the Badancaco camp, showing no mercy as they slaughtered its inhabitants. Geronimo returned that evening to a scene of unimaginable horror. The camp had been ravaged, bodies of his people lay scattered, the flames of destruction still smoldering. But it wasn't just any death and destruction that awaited him. In the cruelest blow, he discovered that his own family had been among the victims. His beloved mother, his wife, and his 3 young children, all had been mercilessly murdered by the Mexican soldiers. The grief that gripped him was beyond words. "I had lost all," he would later write in his autobiography, the deep void of sorrow and loss weighing heavily on his soul. This singular moment of tragedy would become the defining catalyst for the next phase of Geronimo's life. No longer would he simply be a warrior fighting for his people's survival. Now he would be a man driven by an insatiable thirst for vengeance. The blood of his family cried out to him, demanding retribution, and Geronimo was all too willing to heed the call. From that day forward, he swore a solemn oath of vengeance against the Mexicans, and he would make it his life's mission to exact retribution for the massacre of his loved ones. Geronimo embarked on a relentless campaign of bloody raids against Mexican soldiers and settlements. His tactics were merciless, his determination unyielding. The once peaceful Apache, who had simply fought to protect his people, now became a warrior consumed by vengeance. He hunted down Mexican forces with a cold, calculating fury, leaving a trail of blood and destruction in his wake. Geronimo would later reflect on this dark chapter of his life with chilling detachment, stating, "I have killed many Mexicans. I do not know how many. Some of them were not worth counting." As Geronimo waged his campaign of revenge, he became a figure of terror to the Mexican forces. His raids were swift and brutal, and his ability to slip away into the desert undetected only added to the fear he inspired. The name Geronimo began to spread, not just among his own people, but among his enemies as well. To the Mexicans, he was a ghost, a warrior who could appear without warning, strike with deadly precision, and vanish into the rugged landscape as if he had never been there. His vengeance was relentless, and with every raid, he sent a clear message: the murder of his family would not go unpunished. Despite the escalating violence between Geronimo and the Mexican forces, his struggle was far from over. The United States government, too, had its eyes set on Apache land, and Geronimo soon found himself fighting on two fronts, against the Mexicans and against the relentless advance of American settlers and soldiers. As the American government began to push deeper into Apache territory, they too became targets of Geronimo's wrath. His raids did not discriminate between Mexican and American forces. To him, they were all invaders, threatening the survival of his people and his way of life. Geronimo's fight against the U.S. government became just as fierce and unyielding as his war with the Mexicans. Time and time again, he evaded capture, leading a small band of followers through the harsh deserts and mountains, always one step ahead of the pursuing soldiers. For years, Geronimo remained at large, a living symbol of Native American resistance. The U.S. military devoted thousands of troops to tracking him down, but Geronimo's deep knowledge of the land and his guerrilla tactics made him a near impossible target. His continued defiance became a source of frustration and embarrassment for the U.S. government, which could not seem to bring this one Apache warrior to heel. But even the fiercest fighters cannot evade capture forever. In 1886, after years of waging his personal war against both the Mexicans and the U.S. government, Geronimo finally surrendered. He was promised that he and his followers would be allowed to return to their homeland, but this promise was betrayed. Instead, Geronimo and his people were shipped off to Florida as prisoners of war, where they would spend years in captivity, far from the lands they had once called home. For Geronimo, the years of captivity were a bitter end to a life of fierce independence and relentless struggle. But even in defeat, his legend continued to grow. Geronimo had become more than just a man. He was a symbol of defiance, of the Apache spirit that refused to be broken. His name, once spoken in fear by his enemies, became a rallying cry for Native American resistance. Geronimo's story, marked by profound personal loss and the unyielding desire for revenge, continues to resonate as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring fight for justice. Even in captivity, Geronimo remained a powerful figure, his presence a reminder of the long and painful history of Native American resistance against foreign invaders. Though he would spend the rest of his days as a prisoner of the U.S. government, Geronimo's legacy as a fierce warrior and a symbol of defiance lived on. His name, whispered in fear by his enemies, would echo through the ages, a lasting reminder of one man's fight to avenge his family and defend his people. The Mexican-American War and the Gadsden Purchase in the 1840s and 1850s marked a significant turning point in the history of the Chiricahua Apaches. Once a proud and free people whose domains spanned the rugged mountains and deserts of what is now the American Southwest and northern Mexico, their land was suddenly absorbed into the expanding boundaries of the United States. This shift brought with it a relentless influx of white settlers, all of whom were eager to claim the land that had belonged to the Apache for generations. The Chiricahua, under the leadership of figures like Geronimo, did not take this invasion lightly. For years, they violently resisted, engaging in raids and skirmishes that became infamous across the frontier. Geronimo's reputation as a fierce and cunning warrior only grew during these years of conflict, as he and his people fought tooth and nail to preserve their way of life. But the tide of history was against them. The U.S. Army, bolstered by superior numbers and resources, launched a series of sustained campaigns against the Chiricahua. After years of bloody conflict, with both sides suffering heavy losses, the Apaches found themselves cornered. Faced with overwhelming pressure, they were forced to negotiate a peace. albeit a reluctant one. The promise of peace, however, came with a bitter price. By 1876, the majority of the Chiricahuas were rounded up and shipped off to the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona, a desolate and inhospitable place that was far removed from the fertile lands they had once called home. San Carlos was a place of hardship and despair, with its barren landscape offering little in the way of sustenance or hope for the Apache people. Geronimo managed to avoid the reservation for a time, continuing to elude capture and clinging to the remnants of freedom in the mountains and deserts he knew so well. But his luck eventually ran out. In 1877, after nearly a year on the run, he was captured by Indian agents. Shackled and in chains, the proud warrior was forcibly brought to San Carlos, joining his people in their grim new reality. For a man like Geronimo, the transition to life on the reservation was nothing short of torture. Though he attempted to adapt, even trying his hand at farming like many of his fellow Chiricahuas, the land was harsh and unforgiving. The Apaches, once fierce and independent, now found themselves confined to this barren place, stripped of their freedom and dignity. But the fire that burned within Geronimo had not yet been extinguished. The land of San Carlos could not quench his thirst for freedom, and he could not accept the idea of living out the rest of his life as a prisoner in his own homeland. Between 1878 and 1885, Geronimo and his allies staged 3 daring escapes from the reservation, each time slipping away from the watchful eyes of the U.S. government and making their way back to the rugged terrain that had once provided them with sanctuary. These escapes were not merely acts of defiance. They were a desperate attempt to reclaim their freedom, to live once again on their own terms, far from the suffocating grip of the reservation. Each escape was perilous, requiring cunning, resilience, and an intimate knowledge of the land. Geronimo and his small band of followers would vanish into the wilderness, using the rugged mountains and deserts as cover, and for a time, they would once again taste the freedom that had been so cruelly taken from them. But freedom was fleeting. Each time they escaped, the U.S. Army would mobilize its forces, hunting Geronimo and his followers with increasing intensity. The small band would live on the run, constantly moving, always looking over their shoulders for the soldiers that pursued them. The conditions were harsh, the threats unrelenting, but Geronimo and his followers refused to submit. By the time of his final escape in 1885, Geronimo had become a living legend, a ghost who could not be caught, a warrior who refused to surrender. His resistance against the U.S. government became a symbol of the Apache struggle for freedom, and his ability to evade capture was both a source of frustration for the U.S. military and a testament to his extraordinary resilience. For years, Geronimo led his followers through the harsh deserts and mountains of the Southwest, continuing to resist even as the odds against him grew insurmountable. Eventually, though, even the most determined warriors must face the weight of history. In 1886, after years of being hunted, Geronimo finally surrendered to U.S. forces. His final capture marked the end of the Apache resistance, and Geronimo, once again in chains, was shipped far away from the land of his birth. He spent the remainder of his life as a prisoner of the U.S. government, first in Florida and later in Alabama and Oklahoma, far from the deserts and mountains that had shaped him. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Today, we bring you a story full of surprises and hidden angles that few people know about. Don't leave just yet. Just when you think you've figured it all out, there are fascinating and meaningful details waiting for you at the end of the video. Let's explore together and uncover the special message this video has for you. Are you ready? Let's get started.